It was 2003, and I was pretty new to redacted New Jersey. I had, at the time, gotten hooked on a game called Fire Emblem, and had found the one other weird nerd in the school that also played it. He was kind of a loudmouth, and his love of the game was just as outspoken and blunt. He loved the characters, he loved playing it on normal mode and just feeling powerful and cool. He boss abused, he arena abused, and I started to do the same, patiently building character after character, just kind of lost in the sheer bliss, the raw power fantasy of it all. It was in that headspace that I met the second of my three best friends of pre-middle school, the third of which would follow me into high school and well into my adult life. But this second friend kind of bluntly insisted that his current obsession, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, was, quote, better Fire Emblem. I can't actually quote him because it's been 19 years and my memory is not that good, but we did get into a fight about which one was better. He let me borrow that game. He was, to be clear, quite a strange friend to have. His family was going through, some shit that I barely understood meaningfully then because I was a child, but it was clear enough to me that I really didn't have a leg to stand on over my comparatively mild family issues. This would set the tone for how I thought about my life for, Well, needless to say that this nameless friend of mine was formative to my tiny brain. He made it really clear to me that he called the man who contributed to his existing father, but he'd call the man he really saw as his father Dad. It was now 2004, and current President George W. Bush had won re-election, and I barely understood anything about politics, but I felt the urge to express something, some kind of distinct anguish to appropriately mirror the distress my parents are going through at the news. So I spent hundreds of hours in my room, quietly listening to the album Tiger Milk by Belle and Sebastian and playing a new copy of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance that I bought, having realized that it was an exceptionally good game. Most of the people that I talk to about Final Fantasy Tactics Advance have two predominant things to say about it. One is that the game isn't as good as Final Fantasy Tactics, a game for a console I didn't have and could never work up the courage to ask my mom to get, and that you play as the bad guy in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. I'll leave that for my inevitable video on FFTA, but that's a very wrong statement to make about what is a relatively simple to understand story. Anyway, this was around the time that my stepfather was trying to meet me halfway on my incredibly nerdy interests. He found out that I really liked the manga my brother had gotten into, Ranma One Half, a story about a boy who could turn into a girl when splashed with cold water, and vice versa when splashed with hot water. So my dad went to try and engage in that. He bought me a manhwa series known as Ragnarok, which I fell in love with, and which seemingly stopped production after Volume 10, leaving me on a cliffhanger that I'm still waiting on, just like that one show from my even earlier childhood, Ronin Warriors. I never figured out what happened to those guys. My dad didn't stop there, though, and was recommended to him at the Barnes & Nobles he went to get me things to have me try out Tsubasa, a story I really, really liked for a long time, and almost finished reading before it was revealed that, I think it was that there were two, Shaorans, and that Sakura was she her own grandmother? Look, it was the series that got me to realize that vampires were actually really hot, and that sacrificing yourself, giving parts of yourself up for the things you care about, really touched my heart. I really hope that the vampire and the ninja guy got together at the end of that. When my dad found out that I'd spent hundreds of hours listening to Tiger Milk by Belle and Sebastian while playing Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and by hundreds, I think 131 hours by the in-game clock's count, he did two things. First, he made me a mixtape of all of his favorite indie bands, got me a bunch of other Belle and Sebastian albums, most of which kind of slid right off me until I became an adult and realized that If You're Feeling Sinister is a fantastic album, and that the efforts to remake that album with better production values kind of missed the point of just how personal that clumsy recording really felt. He also bought me Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls, knowing only that I liked exactly one Final Fantasy title that played really distinctly unlike any other in the series. I guess except for the other tactics games, but, okay. At the time, I did not like Final Fantasy 1 or 2. Exploring in either game felt difficult, I had no guides, I really just felt frustrated and lost for a while, and all the while my nameless Final Fantasy appreciating, family trouble having friend mythologized Final Fantasy VII to me. He described it as a game that was cruel to you, almost impossibly so. he was unfocused, or maybe I just wasn't paying good attention, but I remember very few things about what he was telling me at the time. He described that you got this healer, the only healer in the game, but she dies and you don't get a new one. He told me that it had the hardest boss fights in RPG video games ever. The way he talked about this game made it sound like this impossible pinnacle of perfection in video game form, and this was at the time that I was obsessed with finding a computer that could play Ragnarok Online, maybe months before my brother would start playing World of Warcraft. But Final Fantasy VII was on a console I didn't own and could never ask my parents to get me, so I had to let that dream kind of quietly die for a while, which was hard to do because that friend introduced me to a friend of his, who was a very different kind of Final Fantasy nerd. She lent him a copy of Final Fantasy X too, saying that he could keep it because she hated it. She also got me into Persona 3, a game that I love and may love for the rest of my natural life, no matter how many English voice actors in its cast turn out to be kind of scumbags. The next piece of Final Fantasy media I consumed actually was Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. As a fun aside, before I played Final Fantasy VII, before I even touched the game it was a sequel for, it is not a good film. My love of Persona 3 grew infectious. I needed to see that game through to the end. I had to know what on earth happened to these sad anime children. I was so distraught that somehow that translated to my mom and dad, who were at the time concerned about the influence video games are having on their children. But for some reason, they broke brand loyalty as I was just entering high school. And I had a PlayStation 2, which ended up being a major game changer. From there, I realized that with my allowance, I could cautiously save up to buy PS2 Final Fantasy games at bargain prices. I got Final Fantasy X too, even though that friend of mine was willing to give her copy to me for free, and I'd like to think it's because when I had dinner at her house once, her parents asked if I was vegetarian, to which I shrugged and replied, well, I eat fish, to which this adult woman, the mother of this friend I was more friends with our shared mutual friend than her, said to me, a then preteen, "Oh, so you're a hypocrite then?" To which I replied to, again, this adult woman, "Yeah, I guess so." I went further, though, and it was at this time that I was making internet friends, the true villain of the story, I think. That's when I started to catch wind of what people thought of the series as a whole, talking about which old games were good and which were bad, and it was a conversation I felt compelled to be a part of, but one I really just couldn't because I played so little of the series. It was the reveal that Final Fantasy III was being remade for the DS that got me to consider that I could, and probably should, play through the entire series, except for FF11, which was an MMO, and those were the devil, by this point in my family dynamic, for reasons better left unsaid. I got Final Fantasy III at my local GameStop, and while I was there I realized that I had some birthday or Christmas or whatever kinds of weird spending money I had saved up, and there are some old GBA games behind the glass case under the cashier's desk, and that's when I picked up a triple feature. I managed to get, overwhelmingly, Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 for the GBA. FF5 in particular, I was told, was a rare find. I had to play them all, particularly because I had been told by then that Final Fantasy VII, the golden goose that I was trying to save, no joke, $160 some odd to get a physical copy delivered to me, was overhyped, not that good, and that Final Fantasy VI was better. I have two reasons for telling you this story. Firstly, I don't really feel compelled to talk about Final Fantasy VI directly. I've been struggling with the script for months, and it honestly wasn't clicking for me because Final Fantasy VI is one of those iconic titles, like Final Fantasy V before it. What makes it good is self-evident, and unlike Final Fantasy V, it isn't the kind of sleeper hit that's worth at least showcasing to people in an effort to give it a little more love. What makes Final Fantasy VI good is well-worn ground. It's a sweeping story with a cast of 14 characters, most of which have a robust part of the story we get to engage with, a ton of side content that reveals more about them. It features a villain that's so #damaged that he literally ends the world halfway through the game, and the second half is spent trying to bring the game back together to kill him in an act of post-apocalyptic petty vengeance. It's a really good SNES game. The other reason I wanted to tell this story is because I have struggled a lot in the Pixel remasters around a very specific point. These games, these remasters were not made for me. I think that's obvious at this point. But there's a pressing, almost suffocating concern that I have in talking about them, because there's this kind of pervasive, subconscious, subcultural idea that I, on some level, don't really get to claim these games, right? Like, okay, that's obviously silly. We're all mature grown-ups here. I respect that about you all, but, like, these games weren't my childhood in the way that, like, Ocarina of Time, or trying to play Mario 64, or even maybe Final Fantasy Tactics Advance or Fire Emblem was. I wasn't playing Final Fantasy, the original game, on my NES. I was busy dying over and over in Mario Bros. That's a deceptively hard game, by the way. I don't get to remember what it was like to manage 4 distinct inventories, or that the game didn't let you retarget if the enemy dies before a party member's turn. I didn't play quote-unquote Final Fantasy II on the SNES because we got an SNES, like, way later than when it was a current system. We had to rent it from the Schnucks down the street in Redacted, Illinois, and when we did that, we almost always rented Super Mario RPG. I didn't get to play quote-unquote Final Fantasy III either. Not at that time. My version was, and may always be, Final Fantasy VI Advance. So why talk about these games? Like, why be so obsessed over why these pixel remasters are doing a very clear thing here? I mean, it's obvious now, right? Like, they're trying to capture the feeling of how these games were when they first came out. Prettier, smoother, more pleasant, but otherwise ignoring the era of Final Fantasy that I lived in. Orphaning me from my childhood with these games in favor of the people who I talked to online, who insisted that the myth of Final Fantasy VII I lived under was trash, compared to the sublime majesty of when RPGs were good, i.e. the era of Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. But my experience with these games, all of them, was oddly celebratory. Let me explain. The GBA era of Final Fantasy, covering 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, were all in on the ideas that started to form in the later editions of the game. Usually the hardest challenge in these titles was the final boss, with the exception of things like the War Mech in Final Fantasy I. This was changed in Final Fantasy V with the inclusion of Omega and Shinryu, 2 absurd, I almost want to call them like jump scare enemies in the final dungeon, way stronger than a casual player would be ready to handle after running into a moving enemy or opening an otherwise innocent looking chest. FF6 sort of had this too, with that dinosaur enemy in the Dinosaur Island in the World of Ruin, plus the optional dungeons you could fight, though they weren't really as hard as Kefka. It wasn't really until FF7 that the idea of a super boss really robustly took hold. Ruby Weapon had to be sought out. You had to come in either solo or with 2 dead party members in order to even start the fight meaningfully. Emerald Weapon has a timer that you need to beat it under, or you use a special materia that removes the timer, only to find out that, like, the boss has a special attack that deals more damage the more materia you have on. By the time these games were remade into the GBA, the idea of pushing the game's mechanics to their limits was a part of Final Fantasy, from the weapon fights in 7 to Omega Weapon in 8, Ozma, Nemesis, Yasmat. The idea to retrofit super bosses into these old games took hold, which may be interesting to unpack in their own rights. Like no shade on no shade on Final Fantasy the First, but its system was not particularly robust. The mechanics were pretty simple. Hell, like, even in the Dawn of Souls version, the dominant strategy remained largely the same if you were fighting Chaos to if you were fighting Shinryu. Buff your melee attackers, shield and heal the party, and chip away at the boss's massive HP pool until it's done. These boss fights, some of which I still haven't done, like the idea of them, the idea of facing an enemy like Omega Mark II or the Kaiser Dragon feels overwhelming to me because, well, I don't know, because I was raised on Fire Emblem, and once my brother told me that when we were kids that hard mode in Fire Emblem was designed to exclude units, like some characters were just not viable, and that messed me up, and I made the decision that I'd just be bad at video games if it meant that I could enjoy any character, any configuration, any weird imposition I put myself under. So the idea of, like, being good at these games has stuck in my head forever as an impossible bar. Like what if I don't roll a white mage in my party in FF1? I really don't think I could beat the super bosses without one. The point I'm circling around a bit here is that getting to these titles, getting to Final Fantasy VI, a game I kind of love, despite the way people use it as the apex of the series, that literally everything else after this one shining gem is just trash, getting to this remaster, able to conquer basically every challenge it threw at me, felt hollow. like an unearned victory, that I've been in this a transition period with it, like too good for the original, not good enough for its most intense challenges. It is, like, to be clear, a very small problem to hinge an entire video on, but I think it's important to really dig into because nostalgia is the critical element at play. These games are, unfortunately, lamentably, unavoidably, efforts from a company to cash in on consumer nostalgia. That's fine. Like, I'm kind of upset about it because nostalgia as a means to reflect on what made art meaningful to us back when we were younger could be a fun, useful, even interesting thing to unpack and like, examine, but it has turned into a major cornerstone of the overwhelming majority of popular media coming out. Remakes, remasters, relitigation of comic books. I don't really need to go into this rant, but I just wanted to speak clearly to my experience, to my nostalgia. I am left out of this. I'm not the target for the Pixel remasters. No matter how much I love the series, or I think that the ideas, the methods behind how the games reinvent themselves from installment to installment makes the property feel fresh and thoughtful, no matter what, like, not even my weird, sick, like, adoration of Stranger of Paradise can save me from the fact that the executive decision on reviving the oldest parts of the series considered that it would be more profitable to court the fans of the original releases, and I am not here to tell them that they were wrong for doing so. I just wanted to reflect on it all. I wanted to speak for my younger version of myself who, upon getting Final Fantasy VI ready to impress my internet friends by reporting that it was very good, ended up getting talked down to because Final Fantasy VI Advance wasn't nearly as good as the original because the GBA's sound system ruins the majestic soundtrack. There's this feeling that I have lingering over me when I look at these parts of my past. I don't have excellent self-esteem. I've struggled with depression for a very long time, first in denial about it, then reveling in it, then crushed by the harm it's done to me and the people I care about. I'm not saying that video games are to blame, or that my internet friends have given me mental illness or anything like that, just that this whole thing is indicative of the kinds of narratives in my head, in feeling like there is an ephemeral idea of how to be in a community, how to be properly part of a group of people with ostensibly the same interest. It's this idea that I can never grasp. I like the wrong games. I like the wrong versions of the right games. What I like about them isn't wrong, just weird, alienating, enough to make me feel like I don't know, like a poser, a weirdo, eccentric. And now I get to look at these high-profile, shiny, creatively presented versions of other people's nostalgia and wonder, how much have I changed? Special thanks to Brandon Haney, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T., Dector A., both Dulles brothers, Lewis Wells, Low Res, Maria Aladren, Alistair V., Natalie Lane Baker, Nurai the Redmarked, Pahor, Professor Bopper, St. Rawberry, Thomas Vulpes, and Zetetic.